When his fingers brushed against me, it wasn't just the shock of the moment, it was the flood of everything I'd tried to suppress. That night changed everything. What do you do when the forbidden is no longer just a thought, but a touch, a choice, a consequence? Stay tuned, because this story will take you into the deepest secrets of my life. Don't forget to subscribe and tell, where are you watching from? When David's hand brushed mine as he reached for the sponge, the world seemed to pause for a moment too long. I froze, staring at the streak of water running down the sink, willing my pulse to steady itself. His voice, low and laced with casual warmth, cut through the charged silence. "Let me help, Mom. You've been scrubbing away all evening." The word "Mom" from his lips felt heavier than it should. I laughed nervously, pulling my hand away and giving him a smile that felt thin even to me. "It's fine, sweetheart. I've got it under control." David stood closer than he needed to be in the small kitchen. The dim light above the counter cast a soft glow over his face, his sharp features shadowed in ways that made him look older than his 22 years. I turned my focus back to the soapy plates, my hands shaking ever so slightly as I scrubbed. "You work too hard," he said, his tone somewhere between teasing and sincere. "Seriously, Dad's always saying you should relax more." I couldn't bring myself to look at him. Someone has to keep this place running. There was an unspoken weight in the air, like the quiet before a thunderstorm. My husband, Charles, had just left for another night shift at the hospital. It was routine by now, him slipping out the door with a kiss on my cheek and a promise to be back in the morning. But tonight felt different, though I couldn't pinpoint why. David leaned on the counter, his voice softening. "You shouldn't have to do everything alone, you know." I glanced at him then, finally meeting his blue eyes that always seemed to hold a quiet intensity. "It's part of being a wife and mother," I replied, trying to keep my voice light. "Maybe it shouldn't be," he said, his gaze lingering. The words sat between us, their meaning unclear but undeniably significant. I dried my hands on a dish towel, eager to escape whatever was unraveling. "Why don't you go pick out a movie? I'll join you in a bit." He nodded, pushing off the counter with a lopsided grin. "Deal, but you're picking the snacks." I managed a laugh, relieved as he walked out of the kitchen. The moment passed, but the echoes of it lingered, stirring something I didn't want to name. The living room was cozy, the glow from the TV casting soft shadows on the walls as David scrolled through our streaming options. I set a bowl of popcorn on the coffee table and sank into the armchair opposite the couch. It was safer this way. The distance between us, the buffer of space keeping everything normal. "Come on, sit over here," he said, patting the cushion next to him. "You're too far away. It's not like we haven't shared a couch before." I hesitated, but his teasing grin made refusal feel dramatic. "Fine, but only because I'm too tired to argue." Sliding onto the couch, I left enough space between us to fit another person. David smirked but said nothing, his focus returning to the screen. He picked a light-hearted comedy, something we'd watched together years ago when he was still in high school. Nostalgia wrapped around us like a familiar blanket, and for a while, everything felt simple again. Halfway through the movie, his arm stretched along the back of the couch, casually resting near my shoulder. It wasn't unusual, but tonight the gesture felt different. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was tired and reading into nothing. Still, my body betrayed me, tense and hyper-aware of every movement. "Relax," he said softly, his voice close enough to stir the hairs on the back of my neck. "You're wound up tighter than usual." I laughed awkwardly, shifting in my seat. "Long day, that's all." He didn't reply, but the weight of his presence was impossible to ignore. The warmth of his arm near mine, the subtle scent of his cologne, it all pressed down on me in a way that felt both comforting and suffocating. I focused on the movie, determined to keep my thoughts from straying into dangerous territory. As the credits rolled, I stood abruptly, gathering the empty bowl. "I'll clean this up," I said, eager for the sanctuary of the kitchen. David followed, leaning against the doorway as I rinsed the bowl. "You are avoiding me," he said, his tone half joking, but with an edge that made my stomach flip. "Don't be silly," I replied, keeping my back to him. "I just don't like leaving a mess." He chuckled, stepping closer until he was just behind me. "You're not a very good liar, Mom." The words hung in the air, his voice softer now, almost challenging. I turned to face him, the damp bowl clutched in my hands like a shield. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shrugged, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Nothing, just that I know you better than you think." I searched his face, trying to decipher the mix of emotions there. It was a dangerous game, one I didn't know the rules to. "Go to bed, David. It's late." For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then he smiled. Soft, almost tender. "Good night, Mom," he said, brushing past me as he left the room. I stood there long after he was gone, the weight of his words and the look in his eyes sinking into me. Sleep wouldn't come easily tonight. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the table where I sat with my coffee. The air was cool, crisp, but it did little to calm the storm brewing inside me. David's words from the night before echoed in my mind, leaving an unsettling warmth in their wake. I tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the mundane tasks of the day: grocery lists, errands, laundry, all the things that should have been enough to fill the hours. But even as I folded my husband's shirts or filled the pantry, my thoughts strayed to David. By late afternoon, he emerged from his room, hair tousled and an easy smile on his face. "Hey, Mom," he said, grabbing a glass of water from the kitchen counter. His tone was casual, but his eyes lingered on me for just a beat too long. "Good morning. Well, afternoon," I replied, my voice betraying none of the unease I felt. "Late start for you?" He shrugged, leaning against the counter. "You know me. I'm not much of a morning person." I busied myself wiping the counters, avoiding his gaze. "Plans for the day?" "Not much. Thought I'd hang around here, maybe help you with some things." I glanced at him then, raising an eyebrow. "Help me? Who are you, and what have you done with David?" the girl demanded. He grinned, the familiar charm in his expression softening the tension between us. "I'm full of surprises." The day passed in a blur of domestic tasks, David hovering closer than usual. He helped carry groceries, fixed a squeaky door hinge, and even offered to fold laundry, a task he had avoided his entire teenage life. At first, I welcomed the company, grateful for the rare moments of connection. But as the hours wore on, the invisible thread between us grew tauter, pulling us into a shared orbit that felt both exhilarating and dangerous. That evening after dinner, he lingered at the table while I cleared the plates. My husband was working late again, and the house felt too quiet, the space between us too charged. "You're really on top of things," David said, his voice warm. "I don't know how you do it all." I shrugged, carrying the dishes to the sink. "You just manage. It's part of the job." He stood, moving to join me at the sink. His presence was palpable, his body close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him. Maybe you shouldn't have to manage everything alone. I froze, the plate in my hand slipping slightly before I caught it. David, I began, my tone firmer than I intended. You shouldn't say things like that. Why not? He asked, his voice steady but gentle. It's not like I'm wrong. His words sent a shiver through me, a mixture of fear and something I couldn't name. I turned to face him, meeting his gaze with as much resolve as I could muster. Because it's not appropriate. For a moment, the air between us crackled with unspoken tension. Then he stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I exhaled, the breath I hadn't realized I was holding escaping in a shaky sigh. I know what you're thinking, she said. The days that followed were a careful dance, each of us testing the edges of the invisible line between us. David continued to find reasons to be near me, helping with chores, joining me for errands, lingering in the living room after dinner. I told myself it was innocent, that I was overthinking things. But the way his gaze lingered, the way his touch lingered, in the briefest of moments, told a different story. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, he reached for the blanket draped over the backrest. Here, he said, spreading it across my legs. You looked cold. Thanks, I murmured, pulling the fabric tighter around me. He settled back into his seat, his arm once again resting along the back of the couch, just inches from my shoulder. The show played on, but I barely registered it, my focus entirely on the rhythm of his breathing and the occasional shift of his hand. You seem distracted, he said suddenly, his voice low. I'm not, I replied too quickly, my gaze fixed on the screen. You are, he countered, leaning in slightly. Is it something I said? She said, No, I said, my voice firmer now. David, I think we need to set some boundaries. His brow furrowed, and for the first time he looked genuinely hurt. Have I done something wrong? The question caught me off guard, the sincerity in his tone disarming. No, I admitted. But this, us spending so much time together, it's starting to feel... He leaned back, nodding slowly. I understand. I felt a pang of guilt at the defeated note in his voice, but I forced myself to ignore it. Thank you. Wow. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed the conversation in my mind. Had I done the right thing, or had I overreacted to something that was never there? My thoughts were a tangle of guilt, doubt, and a lingering warmth that I couldn't quite shake. The sound of footsteps in the hallway startled me. I sat up, my heart racing as a soft knock sounded at the door. Mom? David's voice was muffled but clear. I hesitated before answering. What is it? The door creaked open and he stood there, silhouetted by the dim hallway light. I just wanted to say good night. Good night, I replied, my voice trembling slightly. He lingered for a moment before stepping inside. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said, though the quiver in my voice betrayed me. He crossed the room, stopping at the edge of the bed. You seem... upset. Did I upset you? No, I said quickly. It's just been a long day. He nodded, his expression softening. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable around me. I don't, I lied, the words catching in my throat. He reached out then, placing a hand gently on my shoulder. The gesture was meant to be comforting, but it sent a ripple through me that I couldn't ignore. You're important to me, he said softly. I swallowed hard, my gaze dropping to the bedspread. You're important to me too, David, but we can't. I know, he interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. I know. For a moment we sat in silence, the unspoken words between us heavy and suffocating. Then he stood, his hand falling away. Good night, Mom. As he left the room, closing the door softly behind him, I lay back against the pillows, my heart pounding in my chest. Sleep would not come easily tonight. The next morning, I tried to shake off the lingering tension from the previous night. I threw myself into chores, scrubbing countertops and folding laundry as if sheer effort could cleanse the unease simmering beneath the surface. David was in his room, likely asleep, and I was grateful for the space. But by midday, the house was filled with his presence again. He padded into the kitchen, hair mussed from sleep, and an easy grin on his face. Morning, he said, his voice still thick from sleep. Afternoon, I replied, forcing a casual tone. You slept in. He poured himself a cup of coffee, leaning against the counter as he watched me prep lunch. Late night, I guess. I avoided looking at him, focusing instead on chopping vegetables. We've all been having those. He chuckled softly, and for a moment, the tension eased. It almost felt normal, the kind of easy banter we used to have. But then his voice softened, catching me off guard. Mom, about last night. I froze, the knife still in my hand. David, let's not. I just want to make sure we're okay, he said quickly, his tone earnest. I didn't mean to cross any lines. There was more screams. Oh, dear. I set the knife down, turning to face him. We're fine, I said firmly. But we need to be careful, David. This, whatever this is, it's not healthy. He nodded, but his gaze lingered, searching my face. I don't want to make things harder for you. You're not, I lied, offering a tight smile. Let's just move on, okay? Okay, he said, though the weight in his eyes said otherwise. That evening, my husband called from the hospital, his voice tired but cheerful. Hey, babe, just checking in. Hey, I replied, the sound of his voice soothing and guilt-inducing all at once. How's your shift? Long, he admitted. But at least I'll be home tomorrow night. Maybe we can finally have dinner together. That would be nice, I said, the words feeling hollow even as I said them. I missed him. I did, but his absence had become so routine that I hardly knew how to fill the void anymore. After hanging up, I found David in the living room, sprawled on the couch with his laptop. He glanced up as I entered, his expression softening. Dad. Yes, I said, sitting in the armchair opposite him. He says hello. David nodded, his focus returning to his screen. For a while we sat in silence, the only sound the faint clicking of his keyboard. It was a comfortable quiet, but the memory of our conversation lingered, casting a shadow over the moment. Mom? He said suddenly, breaking the silence. Yes. Can I ask you something? I hesitated, unsure if I was ready for whatever was coming. Of course. He closed his laptop, setting it aside as he turned to face me. Are you happy? The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. What do you mean? In your marriage, he said, his voice steady but gentle. Are you happy with Dad? I stared at him, the weight of the question pressing down on me. That's a complicated question, David. He nodded, as if expecting the answer. I see how much you do, how much you give, and I wonder if anyone's doing the same for you. David, I began, but the words caught in my throat. Your father loves me. I'm sure he does, he said softly. But does he make you feel loved? The question hit like a punch to the gut, forcing me to confront feelings I'd been burying for years. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, I stood abruptly, needing to escape the intensity of the moment. I need to check on dinner, I said, retreating to the kitchen. The following days passed in a blur of tension and avoidance. I threw myself into housework and errands, trying to keep my mind occupied, but David's words lingered like an echo in my head. Was I happy? Did I feel loved? The questions gnawed at me, forcing me to confront truths I wasn't ready to face. David, for his part, seemed to sense my turmoil. He gave me space, retreating to his room or spending long hours out of the house. But when we were in the same room, the unspoken tension crackled like a live wire, impossible to ignore. One evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, David sat on the floor nearby, scrolling through his phone. The quiet was almost soothing, a rare moment of peace in the storm. But then he looked up, his gaze thoughtful. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking the stillness. "Yes? I've been thinking about what I said the other day." "About Dad." I tensed, bracing myself. "David." "I'm sorry," he interrupted, his tone sincere. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I care about you, and I want you to be happy." "I know," I said softly, setting the folded towel aside. "And I appreciate that. But you don't need to worry about me." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I just hate seeing you carry so much on your own." I smiled faintly, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "I'm stronger than I look, sweetheart." He returned the smile, his fingers lingering on mine for a moment before pulling away. The touch was brief, innocent, but it sent a ripple through me that I couldn't ignore. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the moment in my mind, the warmth of his hand still lingering. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting connection born out of shared concern. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The line between us had blurred, and I didn't know how to unblur it. The following morning, I resolved to regain control of my emotions and the dynamics in our home. I couldn't let these lingering thoughts, the small gestures, the heavy words, consume me. I buried myself in preparations for dinner, knowing my husband would be home after his shift tonight. If nothing else, I needed to remind myself of the stability his presence brought. David hovered in the doorway of the kitchen as I worked, leaning casually against the frame. "You're going all out," he remarked, his gaze flickering to the roast I was prepping. "Your dad deserves a nice dinner," I replied, focusing on the cutting board. It's been a long week for him. David crossed his arms, a hint of a smirk on his face. "And for you?" I didn't respond, refusing to meet his gaze. The words carried a weight I didn't want to unpack. Instead, I busied myself with seasoning the roast, ignoring the heat that rose in my chest under his scrutiny. "And you're tense," he said after a moment, his voice softer now. "You've been tense for days." "No, I'm fine," I said firmly, finally turning to face him. "David, I need you to give me some space." His smirk faltered, replaced by a look of quiet concern. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," I said quickly. "It's just, things are complicated and I need some time to think." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I'll be out of your way, then." The pang of guilt that followed his retreat was immediate, but I forced myself to push it aside, Boundaries had to be drawn, and this was the first step. That evening, the house felt almost normal again. My husband sat at the head of the dining table, his laughter filling the room as he recounted stories from his shift. David joined in, chiming with his own quips and observations. I smiled along, grateful for the reprieve from the tension that had plagued the house. But even as I sat there, surrounded by the comforting rhythm of family, my gaze occasionally drifted to David. The way he laughed, the easy confidence in his posture. It was impossible to ignore the shift in him since he'd returned home from college. He wasn't the boy I'd helped raise anymore. He was a man, and that realization only made everything more complicated. After dinner, my husband retired to the living room, exhausted from his long shift. I cleared the table, grateful for the solitude, but it didn't last long. David appeared in the doorway again, his presence filling the space in a way that felt both comforting and suffocating. "Need a hand?" he asked. "I've got it," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. He stepped closer anyway, picking up a stack of plates and carrying them to the sink. "You don't have to do everything alone, you know." I sighed, setting the dishcloth down and turning to face him. "David, I told you, I need space." "I know," he said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "But I can't just stand by and watch you carry all this on your own. It's not fair." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. He was so close now, his expression earnest and unrelenting. For a moment, the air between us felt too heavy, too charged. "You're important to me," he said softly, the words lingering in the air like a confession. "David," I began, but he shook his head. "I know what you're going to say," he interrupted, "and I get it, but I needed you to know." Before I could respond, he stepped back, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I'll go," he said quietly, turning and walking away. I stood there long after he was gone, the weight of his words settling over me like a storm cloud. That night, sleep eluded me once again. My husband lay beside me, his breathing deep and even as he slept, but my thoughts raced. David's words echoed in my mind, mingling with the lingering warmth of his presence. I knew I needed to set firmer boundaries, to regain control of the situation, but the pull between us was undeniable. The next morning I woke early, hoping to clear my head with a brisk walk around the neighborhood. The air was cool and crisp, the sunlight filtering through the trees in golden rays. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of clarity, a reminder of the stability I'd been craving. But when I returned home, David was in the kitchen, a cup of coffee in hand as he leaned against the counter. He smiled when he saw me, but there was a softness in his eyes that made my resolve waver. "Good morning," he said, his tone light but cautious. "Morning," I replied, setting my keys on the counter. "You're up early." He shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." I hesitated, unsure of what to say. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words. "I've been thinking," he said suddenly, his gaze steady, "about what you said, about boundaries." I swallowed hard, nodding. "Good, that's good. I want to respect them," he continued, "but I also want to be honest with you." "David," I began, but he held up a hand. "Just let me say this," he said, his voice steady but earnest. "I know this isn't easy, and I don't want to make things harder for you, but I can't ignore how I feel." His words hung in the air, a confession that made my heart race and my stomach churn. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. I just needed you to know." With that, he set his coffee down and walked away, leaving me standing in the kitchen, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. The days that followed were a careful balancing act. I threw myself into chores, errands, and anything that kept me occupied and distanced from David. But the unspoken tension between us lingered, impossible to ignore. Every glance, every brush of his hand when we passed each other, felt loaded with meaning. Big Zuck. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it or if he was trying to give me the space I'd asked for. He spent more time in his room, more hours out of the house. When he was home, he was cordial but distant, as though he, too, was trying to navigate this fragile terrain. One afternoon I stood in the garden, pruning the hedges. It was mindless work, the rhythmic snip of the shears grounding me in a way few things could. The sun was warm on my back, and for a moment I almost felt at peace. And then I heard his voice behind me. "You've been out here for hours." I turned to see David standing on the patio, a glass of water in his hand. He looked relaxed, his expression soft, but the weight of his gaze was undeniable. "It's good for me," I said, forcing a smile. "Helps clear my head." He stepped closer, setting the glass on the small table near the patio chair. "You shouldn't overwork yourself." I shrugged, turning back to the hedge. "I like staying busy." "I've noticed," he said, his voice quieter now. I focused on the shears, pretending I hadn't heard the undercurrent in his tone. But he wasn't leaving. I could feel him standing there, watching me. "Can we talk?" he asked finally, his voice steady, but hesitant. "David," I began, but he cut me off. "Please," he said, "just for a minute." I sighed, setting the shears down and turning to face him. "Okay, what is it?" He took a deep breath, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "I don't want things to be weird between us." "They're not weird," I said quickly, though we both knew it was a lie. He gave me a look, one eyebrow raised, as if to say, "Really?" I sighed again, crossing my arms over my chest. "Okay, fine. Maybe things have been tense, but that doesn't mean we can't move past it." "I want to," he said, stepping closer, "but it feels like every time I try, I just make things worse." "You're not," I said softly, though my chest tightened as I spoke. "We just need time." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I care about you, Mom. More than I should, maybe, but I don't want to hurt you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "David, it's not right." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but it doesn't change how I feel." The silence between us was deafening, the weight of his words hanging in the air. I looked away, my mind racing for something to say, something to make this all go away. But before I could speak, he stepped back, his expression resolute. "I'll give you the space you need," he said quietly. I just turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the garden, my heart pounding and my thoughts a chaotic mess. That evening, the house was eerily quiet. My husband was working late again, and David had retreated to his room. I sat on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, staring at the TV without really watching it. The events of the day replayed in my mind, each word, each look, gnawing at me. I knew I should feel relief that David had decided to step back, but instead, I felt an ache I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the guilt or the confusion. It was the loss of something I hadn't even realized I valued. As the night wore on, I found myself walking down the hallway toward David's room. I stopped outside his door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What was I doing? What did I expect to say, to do? I shook my head, forcing myself to step back. This was madness. I couldn't let myself get swept up in these feelings, whatever they were. I turned and walked back to my room, closing the door behind me with a shaky breath. The next morning, David was already up and dressed when I came downstairs. He was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as I entered, his expression neutral but wary. "Good morning," he said, his tone careful. "Morning," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "You're up early?" "Thought I'd head out for a while," he said, glancing at his watch. "Clear my head." "That sounds like a good idea," I said, though the thought of him leaving sent a strange pang through me. He stood, picking up his cup and rinsing it in the sink. "I'll be back later." "Take your time," I said, forcing a smile. He nodded, slinging his jacket over his shoulder as he headed for the door. "See you later." I watched him go, the sound of the door closing echoing in the silence. The house felt emptier without him, the stillness oppressive. I tried to busy myself with chores, but nothing could distract me from the gnawing sense of unease. By the time he returned that evening, I had convinced myself to talk to him, to clear the air once and for all. But when he walked through the door, his expression was different, lighter, almost serene. "Hey," he said, setting his keys on the counter. "Dinner smells good." I nodded, my resolve faltering under the warmth of his smile. "Thanks. It'll be ready in a bit." He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Mom, thank you for everything." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I nodded again, unable to find the words to respond. He smiled, brushing past me as he headed to his room. For the first time in days, the tension between us felt manageable. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to normal. "You don't have to pretend you're interested," I said with a wry smile, gesturing to the screen. "There's nothing good on." He chuckled, setting the remote down. "I was just trying to fill the silence." "I like the silence sometimes," I said, though the truth was more complicated than that. Silence could be soothing, but it could also be suffocating, amplifying thoughts I didn't want to confront. He turned to me then, his expression thoughtful. "Can I ask you something?" I hesitated but nodded. "Of course." "Are you happy?" he asked, echoing the question that had haunted me for weeks. I sighed, setting my book aside. "David, that's a hard question to answer." "Why?" he pressed, his gaze steady. "You deserve to be happy." "I am," I said, though the words felt hollow. "I have a good life, a loving husband, a wonderful family." She leaned forward, tugging at my mind. "That's not what I asked," he said softly. "Are you happy?" I looked away, the weight of his question pressing down on me. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "Maybe I haven't thought about it enough." "You should," he said, his voice gentle but insistent. "You give so much to everyone else. Maybe it's time to think about what you need." The words struck a chord deep within me, stirring emotions I wasn't ready to face. "David," I began, but he shook his head. "I'm not trying to make things harder for you," he said quickly. I care about you, Mom, and I want you to be okay." "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And I appreciate that. But some things aren't that simple." Longer expressions. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truths. Then he stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "I think I should go back to campus," he said quietly. "I've been meaning to anyway. There's a lot I need to figure out." The words sent a pang through me, but I nodded, knowing it was the right decision. "If that's what you think is best," Pan murmured as she spoke. But then she thought. He offered a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It is." The next morning, David packed his things and said his goodbyes. My husband, unaware of the tension beneath the surface, clapped him on the back and told him to visit soon. I stood by the door, my heart heavy as I watched David load his car. "Take care of yourself," I said as he turned to face me. "You too," he replied, his gaze lingering on mine. "And thank you for everything." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. He climbed into his car, the engine rumbling to life, and drove away. I stood there long after he was gone, the emptiness in the house now mirrored in my chest. The weeks that followed were quieter still. Without David's presence, the house felt emptier, though I told myself it was a good thing. I threw myself into routines, trying to fill the void with productivity. But late at night, when the house was still, my thoughts wandered back to him. Had I done the right thing? Had we both? The answers felt elusive, slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. My husband noticed the change in me, though he didn't press. "You've been quiet lately," he remarked one evening as we sat at the dinner table. "Just tired," I said with a faint smile. "It's been a busy few weeks." He nodded, accepting the excuse, but his gaze lingered, as if he sensed there was more beneath the surface. As the days turned into months, I found myself reflecting more on the questions David had asked. Was I happy? Did I feel loved? They weren't questions with easy answers, but they forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding for years. My marriage wasn't perfect, far from it. The distance between my husband and me had grown over time, a slow drift that neither of us had addressed. But was it beyond repair? Or was there still something worth salvaging? One evening, as we sat in the living room, I turned to him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Charles," I began, my voice unsteady. "Can we talk?" He looked at me, his expression curious but concerned. "Of course. What's on your mind?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. But then I thought of David, of his insistence that I deserved to be happy, and I found the courage to speak. "I feel like we've been distant, and I think we need to work on that." Charles frowned, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I want us to reconnect, to figure out how to make this work again." For a moment, he didn't respond, his expression unreadable. Then he reached for my hand, his grip firm but warm. "I want that too," he said softly. "I've been so caught up in work, I didn't realize how much I've been neglecting us. I'm sorry." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I blinked them away, nodding. "We'll figure it out," I said. "Together." In the months that followed, we worked to rebuild the connection we'd lost. It wasn't easy. Relationships never are. But we made progress, step by step. And though the memory of those tense weeks lingered, I chose to see them as a catalyst for change, a reminder of what I truly valued. As for David, his visits became less frequent, but our bond remained intact. When he came home for the holidays, we shared a quiet understanding, an unspoken agreement to leave the past where it belonged. And as I stood in the kitchen one evening, watching my family laugh and talk around the dinner table, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The questions that had haunted me were still there, but their edges had softened, leaving room for hope and possibility. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again.